Network, the Health Promotion Research Centre, and the PPI Ignite Network at NUI Galway. So we're really delighted to welcome Dr. Rebecca Murphy today to talk to us. And Rebecca's from Maynooth, and Maynooth are a very important and valued national partner of the PPI Ignite Network. I saw Mark coming in there. So Mark, you're welcome, and you're doing fantastic work in Maynooth in PPI. So Rebecca, your background, you're a sociologist in the field of mental health systems and a lecturer in the Department of Psychology. And your work focuses on trying to democratize the production, dissemination and application of knowledge in both our mental health and research systems. Your work is informed by implementation science, specifically the feasibility and efficacy of co-designing and scaling evidence-based interventions within mainstream health systems. And Rebecca works in collaborative partnerships with peer researchers and community organizations. And together you've used participatory methodologies to include people who are normally excluded, would it be fair to say, from research processes. And I absolutely love your title, Rebecca. You're definitely going to get some questions about this. So your title for today, Resolving Knowledge Injustice in Research is Not Easy, a truthful description of the destinationless but impactful journey. So I'm going to stop talking now and really delighted to hand over to you, Rebecca, and to remind everyone that while Rebecca is speaking, the session is going to be recorded, but for the Q&A session, the question and answer session, we'll stop the recording. Thanks, Rebecca.
Right, thank you, Ruth, and thank you to everyone in NUIG and PPI Ignite there for inviting me. I'll do a little few caveats before I start in terms of, I suppose, understanding why I chose this topic and also where I am coming from as well. So this topic that when Martha first asked me to present today, I thought, well, it was probably a reflection of where I am at the moment in terms of trying to understand how to get this right, morally and democratically right in terms of doing democratic research. And so it's born probably out of my own frustration of how do I do this, and why isn't anyone more people talking about this? And so I thought, well, the first way to do that is for myself to talk about it, and for myself to kind of think, right, well, what happened previously when I was doing participatory methodologies, and truthfully, was that co-production, and do I need to go back now and think about problematizing what happened during those studies and contextualizing what happened during those studies? And it's really, I suppose, the invisibility of this kind of soft work that happens when we do participatory research. And you're hoping that everyone has the skill set of this soft type of work that's needed to really do authentic, morally and equitable participatory research. But maybe some of us have to some extent, and then others maybe don't, or are still on the journey of trying to get there. But the other aspect, I suppose, of caveat of this is I'm passionate about democratizing knowledge production, but equally about democratizing knowledge exchange and dissemination. And so in this presentation, I'm trying to be as less technical and academic-y and flowery as possible, and to be as plain language as I possibly can. And so I'm using kind of imagery and more imagery a lot. And that's not just to trivialize the topics at hand or any issues that we're talking about, but more just to give us maybe what I kind of refer to as a common reference point from which then we can all build on, and which we all understand, and from there we can kind of discuss the breadth and depth and the complexity of each of the topics. The other aspect is that I don't present as an expert, far from it. And so I hope I'm presenting today more from a position of humility, and in doing so hoping that I'll create a safe place for others to feel comfortable to share their experiences and their critical reflections in all of their rawness, and for us, I suppose, to think about how we can learn and progress the field together, specifically in the Irish context that we're in today. I'm known in my family, and my husband sometimes calls me, she's fair raw. And so that's it for our international audience. It would be, well, that I might be blunt at times, and so I do apologise if it comes across a bit more blunt than maybe the usual academic presentations are. Okay. I'll start as well in terms of my proceeding with the talk to explicitly understand and acknowledge my positionality. And I know for some people on the talk that I've talked about this before might have a chuckle. Straight a sociologist, I'm straight into talking about power and privilege. But I am, I think, a privileged identity, white, cisgender, PhD, and from the global north. And so my positionality does impact in terms of the relationships and how I operationalize or how my power is wielded within the participatory process. And also my worldview and my experience of the world is privileged position and a privileged worldview. And so that's not the experience of everybody. And so I can only self-reflect in terms of that positionality here and try and understand, by understanding myself, understand others as well. So also, I don't have any answers, as I say. I have more hope than answers, and I also have lots of questions, and I hope maybe towards the end we'll get to a position where we can talk about questions that other people have, things that I may not have touched on or maybe didn't get the nuance right and how I've presented things, so hopefully that would be the case. I do, in terms of the presentation, hope to consciousness raise a bit about this process and to visualize the invisible work that is happening during the trying to democratize knowledge production. To progress, I suppose, conversations of authenticity, to really understand to what extent we achieved democratized knowledge production or co-production. And I have a hope for a system that will authentically allow us to do this work, to do democratic models of co-production rather than what I refer to later on as maybe technocratic models. Okay. So some context, and everyone, I'm not going to go too much into this because I think everyone has understands where we are at the moment in terms of participatory research. But we are kind of come to this moment in academic research that kind of social factors, cultural factors, political factors have kind of all accumulated into this new era, or what Professor Victoria Palmer calls a participatory zeitgeist. And so it's really how everyone is really merging and convalescing around the need for us to work together across different knowledge systems. And there's different ways of doing this in terms of emancipatory research, citizen engagement, citizen science, public participation, all of these, and how people are really starting to coalesce around this idea around co-production and involving people, involving experts by experience in the design and conduct, and hopefully also in the dissemination of knowledge. With very buzzy word at the moment. And this is what we're trying to essentially achieve, is this kind of conceptual model of co-production in health research. And this is situated not historically, ahistorically or aculturally, or without being in a system in and of itself. So it's happening within society and within what's happening, and everyone brings their own positionalities into this process. But the idea is that if we do this process of co-production, that we will get to a point of higher, high value health research and higher value good health for all, or equitable health provision, by integrating different knowledge systems working together. In this rise of what Palmer calls participatory zeitgeist, there's also this counter narrative happening. And this is not my knowledge, this is knowledge of experts by experience who have long known that co-production in its true itself isn't really or truly happening. And so you'll see, if you engage with platforms by experts by experience, how they have shared their experience of being through research that hasn't truly achieved co-production. And maybe there is this more prolific kind of technocratic models, and I'll deconstruct these kind of terms later on, but these technocratic models of co-production, where, well, in technocratic co-production, what happens is there's a prioritization of the needs of research or the needs of research itself. And yes, the need of research and rather than the needs of the people involved in it. And so there's this rise of that kind of type of co-production and without maybe commensurate focus on more democratic models. Williams et al. In 2020, this is a lovely paper. It's called Lost in the Shadows, Reflections on the Dark Side of Co-Production. And Williams and all of his co-authors talk about this kind of faux production, and they would refer to it as co-ubiquity. And this, I suppose, maybe is specifically situated in the field of mental health research, where we often talk about co-optation of co-production and other concepts and knowledge that experts by experience it was their knowledge then has been kind of co-opted into the system. But they refer to co-ubiquity, and which is an apparent appetite for participatory research practice and increased emphasis on partnership working in combination with the related emergence of a plethora of co-words. And I think we can all relate to that: co-design, co-production, all of these types of co-words. And what that done, and William says here, is promotion, a conflation of meaning and practices from different collaborative traditions. And this phenomenon commonly leads to a misappropriation of co-production, or the use of co-production. So in the rise of this kind of conduct of participatory research, the emergence of all these plethora of co-words, it has detrimentally affected the true meaning of co-production and has led to this kind of conflation of methodologies and approaches. Why is this happening, I suppose? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the kind of work that I have done, or exemplars of work that I have done, and explain what we did, and then talk a little bit later about to what degree have they been aligned or not aligned with the idea of true democratic co-production. So I'll discuss the various ins and outs of them, and then kind of, to what extent did we actually achieve a democratic model of co-production. So this is me, this is 11 years ago in Brisbane, Australia, and I was a research assistant, fresh out of doing a master's, and travelled to Australia to work. And I worked with Professor Sue Kildea and Professor Helen Stapleton in Brisbane, Australia. And we did two evaluations, participatory evaluations of two specialist antenatal clinics in the Mater Mothers Hospital and the maternity hospital there in Brisbane. And one was with mothers of refugee backgrounds, which is us there in the photo, of all different types of experience of coming to Australia and settling there. A lot of those women were maybe the first, were involved as the first refugees that arrived in Australia, and so they had strong community networks across Brisbane. And then the other evaluation was with Indigenous Australians and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Both of these evaluations were run concurrently and simultaneously, and both followed a similar kind of participatory approach, in that there was employment of peer researchers. So the women there were all co-researchers with us, and they were involved and sitting on our advisory committee. They were involved in terms of the conduct of focus groups, the completion of surveys, and then in terms of sense checking our analysis of the data. I'm going to go through these exemplars and then towards the end talk about to what degree are these co-production or not, or the challenges that we've had. So that was the first experience of participatory methodologies. I then returned home to Ireland with that experience and conducted my PhD around the mental health experiences of asylum seekers from the African continent. And this was a study, my PhD, with limited financial resources, and so I was thinking of trying to find ways of still being able to incorporate expert by experiences voices. And so I had a community advisory board, and I also worked with organisations Sprazi and Carja, and they helped me in terms of understanding my methodologies and the appropriateness of those for the community that I was going to be doing the research with. They looked at all of my materials, they gave me advice on it, they looked at my analysis, they also gave me a sense checking in terms of the analysis of it. There was a reciprocal beneficial relationship set up as well, in that I was very conscious that I was doing research and that I would privilegedly benefit from in terms of getting my PhD. And so I wanted to think about how could I also provide value to the community. And so I worked with Carja on research that they were doing and helped train some of their peer researchers. And also in Spirazi, I volunteered there once a week and tried to give back in terms of my own expertise to their service. Okay. This is another piece of research that was done in participatory methodologies, similarly enough to the first exemplar that I gave. This was conducted with Dublin Simon Community and Mental Health Reform and two community organisations. They had already kind of formulated the research question, and then together we thought about what the methodologies would be for that and employment of peer researchers. They sat with us on our advisory board, again, were involved in terms of the collection of data and kind of sense checking of the data in terms of the analysis. We have a microphone on if someone can make sure everyone's muted. Then we laid on to Carja again. So you'll see Carja comes up quite a lot because I've developed a great working relationship with them over time. And so we've also worked together more recently on developing mental health advocacy and support for ethnic minorities. This again, Carja came to me with their requirements and their needs, and together we then decided, okay, these are your needs and how can we then bring them together in terms of research, study and design for you. Carja is an ethnic minority-led organisation, and so we did collaborative research methods, the employment of a peer researcher, again, they looked at materials, they were involved in terms of making sure that the materials were appropriate, that they were relevant to what they needed, and they also did, the sense checking, and we co-authored as well. Okay, nearly there. In terms of, this is another piece of research that looked at the development and impact of peer-led mental health support. And again, these two organisations, Aris Fallon and Gateway, they're both peer-led organisations, experts by experience, who started these organisations and continue to run the organisations. This research was organisation initiated, so like previously they came to the researchers and asked, we need this is our requirements, these are our needs for the research, and we collaboratively thought about what the research methods were going to be. There was co-leadership in the conduct of that research, and there was the employment of peer research assistants, there was co-authorship in terms of writing the report and writing subsequent publications of that. And then in the analysis, again, sometimes it's sense checking exercises to ensure that our analysis did incorporate our relevancy of that analysis. Okay, so whistle-stop tour of some case studies. I just wanted to give you a sense of what kind of they looked like, and so that we can then talk about to what extent they aligned with a democratic model of co-production. Really, it's an understanding of having to understand the spectrum that's involved in terms of participatory research. And so I often return to this figure again and again and critically think about at what point was this informing people? Was it consulting? Is it involving people? Is it collaborating? Or is it getting to that democratic model of co-production, which is an empowering, transformative way of producing knowledge and disseminating that knowledge together, and an integration of an equitable integration of knowledge systems. And really, when I think back and critically look at some of those exemplars, I think we probably got maybe to this kind of collaborative point of the spectrum, but maybe in some ways we got to empowerment, but I think we were either in some ways, maybe my PhD was pure consultation, maybe into the involvement kind of stage, where the majority maybe sat here in terms of between involve and collaborate. So why is there a need to kind of acknowledge this or explicitly tease this out? And I suppose, and this is another model that I think everyone uses or has seen at least once if they're involved in this type of work. And really you're thinking about, are we involving, are we consulting, are we involving, or are we kind of this full partnership, or indeed is it led by experts by experience? I think just to give you maybe a data point in terms of the closest that I think being part of a researcher team that managed to achieve co-production is the OLIS project. And maybe many people won't be perhaps surprised to know that this is led by Professor Agnes Higgins in Trinity College Dublin, a leader that really does lead with humility. And so she doesn't promote herself a lot, and she often says herself that she's not great at self-promotion, but what she does do is get on with the job in terms of being able to co-produce, and she knows her stuff. And so this really was, the OLIS program itself was a co-produced program. It's a psychoeducation program for people with the diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar. And the content of the program, the delivery of the program, and subsequently the evaluation of the program was all co-produced. And so that has been the ethos in terms of the OLIS board, and anything that is arising from the OLIS program continues with that democratic ethos of co-production. And so implementation on the ground, it's a co-facilitated program, experts by experience alongside experts by qualification or healthcare professional deliver it on the ground. And any evaluation that has been done on the program has been co-produced with peer researchers, experts by experience, and co-authored with them also. We also recently did this a democratic knowledge exchange project where we thought about all of our outputs, all of our knowledge outputs were in academic journals. And we'll talk a little bit about this again later on in the presentation, but we really felt that how do we do more democratic knowledge production or knowledge dissemination? And so we did a photo voice project, and that really was a very co-produced project. And I hope maybe some of the co-researchers are on this presentation or seminar today that would be able to maybe attest to this, but it really was, probably because of the selection of the methodology, it enabled this kind of production of knowledge that wasn't dependent on being able to write an academic journal, but was very much dependent on being able to find a method that they could voice their own expertise within it. And we have co-produced academic publications from it also, and that were co-authored by the co-researchers or experts by experience. A funny kind of, a caveat to this is that even in and this is, we'll talk a little bit about the system or the academic system and how it doesn't always allow us to do this work. We had co-authored a paper around everyone's experience of doing the photo voice project. And so our experts by experience, our colleagues, also wrote part of their reflections within the paper. And when the reviewers came back, there was a particular reviewer that seemed to want us to position our co-authors, our experts by experience, as participants rather than the co-authors that they were. And so we had to fight against that a bit and say, well, no, these are co-authors. We wouldn't ask the academic author's age, gender, all these demographic profiles. So why do we need to do that for our experts by experience? And they wanted us to position and frame the paper in the traditional way of academic papers. And so we fought against that and argued that no, these are our colleagues and this is what they wrote without interpretation, without analysis from others. And they deserve to be in the paper just as much as the academic experts. So looking back at those examples that I've given, and when I critically reflect on them, it's not that we framed it as co-production in and of itself, but when you look back now, we really do think, they aren't that democratic model. To some degree, some are, but others not. And I wonder why, and I suppose this is essentially what we were trying to do, or what I was doing, was allowing a seat at the table. And maybe sometimes we rearranged the bits on the table, the knives and forks and the placemats and all of this. But really, probably what we should have been doing is breaking the table up. So really, when you think about democratic co-production, it is about transformative production of knowledge. And if you're working from the same system, that transformative part of co-production isn't enabled or fully facilitated. So I'll talk a little bit about, the table and what's actually happening at the table or within the system of academia that's not fully allowing true co-production. And it is about epistemic power and privilege, are working from kind of Eurocentric frameworks and methodologies, sometimes the limited diversification of participation, and this unchanging and sometimes quite inflexible knowledge system and economy that we're working in. So in other words, the game has changed and we're in this participatory zeitgeist, but we're still working on the same playing field, in that there's still structures and rules and regulations which are in some ways impeding our ability to play the game the way we want. So when we think about a knowledge democracy and what that would look like or doesn't look like at the moment, our research systems, you really need to have a think about how our system works and do a power analysis or a political economy analysis on our academic system. And the research system at the moment is built on this kind of knowledge economy. And who gets a say within that knowledge economy, whose knowledge within that is valid or considered valid, so whose knowledge counts, and what type of knowledge is considered valid, or what type of knowledge is counted when we're looking at knowledge production. And so this is our knowledge economy. And this is why I think we need more of a conversation about what is happening systemically that is impeding or influencing in some ways the way that we do co-production. And so the knowledge economy, what we call it, is it's a system of consumption and this kind of production of knowledge that is based on intellectual capital. So the more qualifications you get, and the more currency or capital you gain, and the more power then you get within that system. So it has a particular culture within it, in that knowledge is formulated, or the knowledge that is produced and formulated within the economy is bound up by the people that work in that economy, the very identity of them, the way that they work and the way that they see the system and their value system. And that worldview, or how people, whose identity is actually operating within our cultural economy. And then how does that interact with other identities that are outside of that? So epistemic privilege. So we as academics and health professionals, researchers and clinicians, we are power actors within the knowledge economy. And so we have a privilege in terms of being seen as people whose knowledge counts and is knowledge valid. And so we decide who and what knowledge is valid. And so we have this epistemic privilege. And so we get to decide what testimonies we will take on, include, what testimonies will we frame, whose testimonies will we include or not include, and how will we shape them. And in doing so, we also talk about what evidence or knowledge counts. So when we think about the type of knowledge that we produce and how we produce it, that is not ahistorical, it's not acultural. The way our knowledge system works was born from a particular time in European Enlightenment. It is a product of that time and of who was involved in creating it. And so it is not the knowledge system that we work from, but it is just one knowledge system available. So it's not, we should be thinking about critiquing the knowledge system, the methods that we use, what evidence is considered valid, and who is considered to be a powerful person within the system. And in doing that, we really start to understand that actually our system kind of structurally disables the ability for other types of knowledge to be introduced, to be accepted within the academy, or within this kind of power structure of academia, and how there is this unequal power dynamics between researchers and the methods that we use, and being seen as people who are experts in a particular field, versus knowledge systems that exist outside of that and are just as equal, just as valid, but don't get a seat at the table and don't get the validity that we do. So we have this type of understanding around epistemic privileges, that we are as academics in the ivory tower, and we have kind of a system which prioritizes particular types of research evidence. And that evidence is often that, you know, the more objective the research is, the closer it is to the truth. And this is kind of, again, arises from our understanding of science and who decided what was science and how we do the scientific method. And then thinking about, well, that's just one type of knowledge. And it's not the knowledge, but it's the knowledge that we are, or the system that we're kind of signed into and indoctrinated into as academics when we do our PhDs and or our undergrads and our masters and all of this. And so it's a system that we are, and I suppose, indoctrinated into. Yeah. Okay. So when we understand now that we have a systemic privilege, we then realize that actually there's also epistemic injustice. And this is Miranda Fricker's work, which is the epistemic injustice, power and the ethics of knowing. So who has power, who has knowledge, and how do they wield that? And so as academics, we have the control about the production and distribution of knowledge. And then there are people that are shut out of those processes due to working from a different knowledge system or due to being marginalized or normatively excluded from that system. And Fricker talks about testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. So she talks about how individuals, maybe their word or their knowledge is afforded less credibility or it's invalidated due to their identity. And hermeneutical injustice is this cognitive disadvantage that when we're trying to make sense of our social experience, we can't do that because there's gaps in our collective understanding. So it prevents some groups from contesting maybe distorted understandings of their social experiences. And I often kind of give the hermeneutical injustice, I often think of it as access to knowledge. And when we think about how we as academics, we think about the cumulative nature of science and how we as academics, before we start anything, we go to the papers that was this field of research that's already been done, and we grow from it and we stand on the shoulder of giants and all of this. When you don't have that system or that collective body of knowledge, what happens is that you don't have that, you're not able to kind of come to this consensus or this consolidation of knowledge together. You're not able to strengthen your knowledge system because you're not being given, or there is no structure or platform from which you can understand your experience and understand the knowledge of others like you. And so what really happens is that we have this kind of structural barrier and social norms that either impede participation or are from our ignorance kind of impede the validity of particular people as people that can produce knowledge. We're saying that no, we're the ones that produce knowledge and you can just participate in it, but we are the real knowledge agents. So it's a social justice framework about looking like this. Is a piece of writing from Diana Rose and Cesare Calatil that I love, and so I thought I would include it. And this is specifically in terms of the field of mental health research, and I'll read it because it's a beautiful piece of writing. We are invited to collaborate within spaces that retain residues of hierarchical dualisms. Our services continue to be risk averse, our lives governed by laws that allow for compulsion and coercion, our distress medicalized. The possible shifts in our positionality as an expert by experience and as a service user who might be sectioned, for example, render our legitimacy unstable. We have fought long and hard for the legitimacy of our knowledge, or more fundamentally, the possibility of a self that is capable of holding legitimate knowledge. But this is a precarious victory. Unlike our collaborators, whose legitimate knowledge is considered inviolable and consistent, the perceived legitimacy of our knowledge shifts with the perceived content of madness in our positionality. So she talks, or I think this really provides a very nice description of epistemic injustice, in which we often invite people to the table, but decide when does their knowledge count and what knowledge that they're providing, does it count? And is that is it quite consistent approach, or does it vary in accordance to when we think they're able to do that, or when we think their knowledge is valid versus when we think maybe their knowledge is not valid today? That's a lovely paper. It's called Power, Privilege and Knowledge, the Untenable Promise of Co-Production in Mental Health. So when I think about this epistemic injustice and how this actually operates, and maybe operated in those exemplars that I gave, I often think about our research meetings and this kind of technocratic tick box of advisory committees or advisory boards, and everyone's sitting at the table together and everyone's got a seat at that table, and then think, but what happens at that table? And this is, again, I want to platform as many papers that I can that are from experts by experience or from more experienced researchers in this field. And this is a really nice paper called Olympus on a Ship. And it's spatio-temporal dynamics of patient and public involvement in research. And they talk about how, when we talk about participatory research, you'll often find the figure that's used as the jigsaw. We say, oh, it's the missing piece of knowledge production, and PPI is this missing piece of this jigsaw. And they contrast that imagery of participatory research with the image of a limpet on a ship. And the limpet is kind of, you know, that shell, or these kind of, courageous lip shells that kind of stick onto the bows of a ship. And it's this kind of stuck on thing that doesn't really make much of an impact. And so they talk about how the spaces and places within which participatory knowledge production happens and who has control of that, who gets to decide, oh, this is PPI input now to this bit, but no, we're not doing PPI input to that bit. And they talk about, in ethnographic studies, really rich detail about research meetings and what happens within lots of different research meetings involved with one particular project, and the power dynamics that were happening at that table, and when experts by experience's knowledge was taken on board, not taken on board, who decided that they got to get a contribution and when they got to have a contribution. So when I think back about my other exemplars and thought, oh yes, we had an advisory board and there was lots of people sitting around the table, I try to think about, yeah, but what happened at that table, and was it a very democratic process? And at times when there was conflict, did we negotiate that out of conflict, or did we neutralize it out of conflict? And so, yeah, I often think negotiation or neutralization. Did we take people's contributions and neutralize them, or did we genuinely negotiate together? So this is, you know, really rich understanding about what actually happens when you try and integrate knowledge systems at a micro level around the research table. The other thing, or the other aspect that I kind of think back in terms of our own exemplars, well, is it palatable participation? So again, who did we decide to bring in, and who did we decide to recruit onto our advisory board? And was it people that looked like us? So that's me looking in the mirror. And was it people that we thought would align with our own thoughts, values, qualifications, everything else? Or did we actively think about challenging ourselves and make sure that we were recruiting people that were going to be a challenging voice, a voice of protest, rather than a voice of palatability? And so this, lots of people talk about this, particularly in mental health research, in terms of, you know, who's actually involved, who is sitting at the table, and are they allowed to provide, you know, really conflicting contributions that might disrupt the whole course of and content of a research? Or are we shaping how they're participating at that table? And there is a need to think about, and this is from Lakeman et al. Again, from mental health systems research, about power doesn't just exist within the academic system, but it's also existing within experts by experience, and how some may have more power than others within amongst their peers. And so if we're only recruiting from the top the top of that triangle there, how far or to what degree or extent do they represent the voices of those at the bottom of the triangle? And so we think, when I look back at the exemplars that I talked about, you know, really, we probably should have been thinking about more diversification of participation and offering people opportunities beyond, you know, one aspect of the research, rather than, you know, and thinking, well, we have 3 PPI contributors and they're going to come with us from start to finish. And really, I think now actually we need to provide more opportunities that people can, if they want, dip in and out of it. But by doing that, we can diversify who's involved and at what point, and provide them with choices as to what point they want to be involved in it. The other aspect I think about, particularly when I think about the research I do with normatively excluded communities, I'm really thinking about my own positionality and the appropriateness of myself doing that. Working from the knowledge system and the position of privilege that I am in, and working with people that don't have that privilege or are working from a different knowledge system also. Sometimes we still use the same methodologies that come from European Eurocentric understandings of methodologies. And I think maybe, particularly say for the 2 evaluations that we did in Brisbane, although we were doing it in a participatory way, that they were involved in the community advisory board and they were involved in the conduct of the research, I think was the methodology itself. Like we did interviews, focus groups, but then we did surveys, and I wonder really the cross-cultural relevancy of some of the methodologies that we used, and really whether we should have been going back to their knowledge systems and asking what knowledge within your system or framework or within your community would have been the best methods to do this, rather than working with very Eurocentric orientation methods. This is again just going back to this kind of hierarchy or understanding about what types of knowledge count, and even though doing participatory research, still speaking to the academy. And so kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out in thinking, right, well, we'll work with communities, but we'll still work within the same framework that the academy wants us to work within. Just to move on to, I suppose, systemic challenges. And I think now we're in this space where we have 2 different things happening, whether within funding partners and then within universities themselves. And we've got to a place now where funding partners in particular are really, you know, seeing the value of PPI and really want us to engage with this participatory way of working, engaging with an integration of knowledge systems and asking us to do that within our grants and within our research. What that does, what I'm concerned about is that it does, I suppose, put pressure on academics that never worked in this area at all, and now are finding themselves thinking, right, well, we have to do PPI, and how will we do it? And we don't have this skill set yet, and we haven't been able to accrue the right knowledge just yet. And so I think maybe sometimes then people tend to over embellish or decide that they maybe oversell the PPI element of their projects without then realizing that they actually have to do that in practice. And what that does is it can introduce harm into the process, in terms of not everyone understanding what co-production, democratic models of co-production are, the time it takes to do that, the skill set that it takes to do that. And I'm not saying, you know, that this isn't a good thing. It absolutely is. The more the merrier, as far as I'm concerned. And I have to say, I do think many of us who work in the participatory field do well to remember that if nobody owns this field of participatory research. You know, the more the merrier. We don't own it just because we've been here for a while. It doesn't mean that we own it or that we are sometimes the leading thinkers on it. That certainly shouldn't be the case. But there is a particular skill set needed, and to do it ethically and morally, and to be able to manage people's expectations in terms of how you're going to be able to achieve it. With saying that, then we come back to the academy and universities and everyone saying, yes, this is a good thing to do, participatory research, experts by experience should be involved in the production and dissemination of knowledge. And academics should be involved in it and should be doing this type of work. But there is kind of structural inequalities within academia and within universities that can impede the genuine production or co-production of knowledge. And, you know, there's aspects that I have been gotten frustrated with in terms of some of the bureaucracy of universities, or the structure that is involved, and in terms of trying to, you know, and everyone talks about this, of trying to genuinely pay co-researchers in a way that is fair, that they can still, you know, if they need to, they can still get their the disability allowance or whatever else, but still be able to be equitably paid for their contributions to the research. I've often even just wanted to hire alternative venues outside of university, or alternative vendors that are more appropriate to the community that I'm working with, and having to go through like a procurement process, or not being able to book particular vendors that I wanted to book because they're not being approved by the university. These things really do challenge academics to actually really do co-production in a way that is meaningful to the community and meaningful to others involved in the process. I often think as well that there's this encouragement to do PPI, and real kind of, maybe even some would feel it as a pressure, but to do PPI, but do it also in the same time frame that you usually do research, within the same budget that we used to give you, and within the same reporting structures that we also gave you before. So again, asking us to play a different game, but not changing the playing field within which we can play that game. And so it really does impede our ability to actually genuinely do a democratic model of co-production. Okay. So who and what needs to change? I'm just conscious of time. If we think about it, we really want a knowledge democracy. What does that look like? If we wanted to dream about what a knowledge democracy would look like. And essentially we're thinking about opposing intellectual colonialism, or what we talked about there before in terms of epistemic injustice. It would be a system that embraced epistemic pluralism or diversity, so acknowledgement that scientific method, or the method to which we as academics sign up, is just but one knowledge system, and that there is other knowledge systems that are just as equal and just as valuable to integrate within our academy. That we understand that a knowledge is created and that it represents multiple forms, and that we understand that knowledge isn't just knowledge, you don't make knowledge just in and of itself, that it is power, and that those who are able to produce knowledge, those who are able to communicate knowledge, that is a powerful position to be in, and that we use that knowledge and we leverage it for more power. And you either think about producing knowledge to wield more power or to perpetuate an existing system, or you use knowledge to really think about socially justice, kind of working from a social justice framework, and using it to advance a more just and healthy world. If we were to think about how that would look in academia, and how it would look within our participatory research, we do really need to think as researchers about explicitly analysing power. And that's power at all different types of level, but also epistemic power, which people are starting to talk more and more about now. And I think we should jump on this bandwagon in the Irish context as well, and really think about how PPI is operationalized, and how we can have this explicit lens on epistemic power. And this is a lovely paper, again, by Maria Rural, I believe is now in UCC. And she talks about the social ecology of power in health research. So it's a very deep dive, I have to say, but it's well worth a read. And these are other two papers. So you see how people are really starting to talk about this now, which is really welcome. I think these again are out the last week or 2 weeks. On Twitter, I found them through brilliant researcher Sayam Hamdullah, and talks about particularly this power analysis in health policy and research. And also this great one, you want to deal with power while riding on power, and how as academics we want to have this explicit lens on epistemic power while being in positionalities of power. Okay, and this is just a demographic or a pictorial of the types of power and the dimensions and the mechanisms within which they're working within health research. So it's really thinking about how we as the academy or research systems are not immune to these kind of things around power, that we're people too, and we are working within this kind of society and system, that we are wielding power, but also maybe are the victims or survivors of power as well. And this is not, again, just to give very constructive feedback, is in terms of a nice table there in terms of how do we actually engage with these questions of power. So that paper is that. This is just to flag that these papers are great, and I get very excited when I see them and I want to divulge in it and go and print them off and read them, and I do, but then I kind of, and this is I think I go into my Stockholm syndrome of academia and think, oh, great, more papers to read. And I think then, but actually, who's reading these? And who has access to these papers? And is the papers, had the language utilized, and is it linguistically democratized as well? Are we really linguistically justice here? And so some of those papers are fantastic, but they're very dense. And, there's sometimes you need to read them once, twice, 3 times before you really understand the concepts. And so by doing these traditional knowledge outputs, knowledge products of academic papers, are we then now perpetuating again this kind of hermeneutical justice or injustice, in that we're not providing knowledge in a way that is accessible and in a way that everyone will understand, and including academics, because I struggle with those papers. So we need to think about, are we really providing accessible knowledge products that everyone, that transcends and whatever expertise that you have, and that everyone can work from the same common reference point. This is, again, just to give you a nice exemplar of actual democratic knowledge exchange. And this is that paper that I referred to, Ollie Williams. But then what they did was this comic strip of the key points that they made in the academic paper, and they then pictorially presented those in this comic strip. And I just thought this was excellent, because when I looked at the comic strip and the key points, this is exactly what they had said in the more dense academic paper. So everyone could have access to the knowledge that they, as experts by experience and as academics, came up with together. And so we get that knowledge, we can build on that knowledge together, and everyone can build on that same collective cumulative understanding of what's happening. And I think this needs to happen with the power analysis. Okay. I also think there needs to be maybe this kind of focus now more on this democratic process and this democratic model of co-production. And I don't mean to be critical of sometimes what I'm hearing a lot is we have to, there's impact of PPI, the outcomes of PPI, and we need to measure it, and that's great. But I suppose I come from a different framework in that I'm thinking, well, I'm doing participatory research for the point of it being operationalizing epistemic justice, and that in and of itself is the means to an end, rather than it being this kind of technocratic process within which we will get better research or we will get better outcomes, which is great. But there's also this need to come back a bit, cart before the horse kind of thing, and really realize, well, do we know what we're measuring when we're measuring it? And is everyone signed up to the same process of actually doing PPI? Because if there's no fidelity in the actual intervention itself or the methods, well, then what were we actually measuring? So I do kind of think about, well, if our motivation purely is just, epistemic justice, that, well, then why are we measuring impact? And who are we proving, or who do we have to justify it to? Okay. I just wanted to be quite practical and to just provide people with actual tools that they could think about actually achieving this. And so this is again a paper I found, and to look at this, lovely, refreshing, no authorship, it's just a writing collective. And so no power in terms of who's lead author, who's last author, who is, the leading thinker in this work. It was obviously a very non-hierarchical position of how they wrote that work. And I just thought that was really refreshing to see that it was just a writing collective and no authorship attached to it. But it gives also this lovely kind of methodology about how would you explicitly look at what happens in co-production within a project. I have to rush through now because I know I'm conscious of time. So again, it's just thinking about systemic honesty. And so we do have concepts and frameworks already within research within which we can draw from. So we know in qualitative research our equivalent of validity and reliability is the words of trustworthiness and authenticity. And so we can work with these common reference concepts that we already know in research and think about, how do we prove the trustworthiness of our methods in terms of co-production, and how do we talk about it with authenticity? And how do we think about our ethics? So we already apply ethical concepts like do no harm, respect, justice, but we often apply these concepts to our participants. And now we need to think about applying them to our methods and to how we're working with our collaborators and with our experts by experience. So there is this kind of need to really think about the intent of why you're doing democratized knowledge production and dissemination, and that if that is a social justice intent, to make that explicit, or if it's a technocratic intent, then to make that explicit. And so for me, it's not a means to an end. It's not just a method that will get me better outcomes or get me better research. It is an end in and of itself. It is to ensure that how we produce knowledge is democratized and that everybody has a chance to be part of that process. So it is about respect for the spectrum and understanding that as we go through the spectrum, we can evolve and we can build the skill sets that we need as academics. And I don't mean to build the capacity of experts by experience or our collaborators. I mean, as academics, that we build the capacity to do this right, and that we do this in a way that's genuine, that's a way that we incrementally learn these skills. Because if in the incremental learning of them, there's less harm perpetuated, and that we don't jump in at the big deep end and then in doing so really maybe do a harmful process to everybody that's involved in it. But we incrementally do this and learn from each other as we go along the spectrum. And lastly, I think there is a need really for system change in academia. And we think about, yes, everyone signed up to the realization that this is a valuable thing to do, participatory research. That's the thing that we need to do. But we also need a system that would allow us to do it. And so we have to think about how academia works, the political economy of academia, and how that is or is not influencing our ability to do this work genuinely. And so we're working towards a kind of theory of change in academia as to how we change what's wrong with us as academics, for want of a better word, and what's wrong with the system, and how can we make it better, and how can we facilitate genuine co-production. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. And I hope I wasn't too blunt or raw, and that people got something from that. Open to questions and to comments and yeah, compassionate critique and other ideas maybe that I didn't touch